Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 49th installment of What is Truth? Hello, everybody. Whoop. And welcome to the Echo. 49th installment of What is Truth? Okay. So there you go. We live in a world of echoes. And, but I feel we're getting closer. The farther away we get, the closer we get. And so it leads us ever onwards in our quest. And in light of the conversation I had this Thursday with Douglas Gabriel of American Intelligence Media, where we're trying to deal with what is cosmic intelligence. And for those of you that haven't caught that yet, you might check it out. It'll help frame some of the things that we've been discussing here for such a long time, although we tend to stress more the arts and culture and the spiritual dynamic that works within the etheric body and the mysteries of the word. And so consequently, as we look into this, I made reference to the indications of Rudolf Steiner that in the Grail castle of the skull, we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and that is the physical representation of the zodiac in a sense. And that likewise in the heart, yes, wonderful book. And likewise in the heart, we have the 12 petaled lotus, that the heart chakra. And so in coming to an understanding of the mysteries of the word in the 16 petal lotus and the 2 petal lotus of the brow and the 12 petal lotus of the heart, it becomes a process of bringing warmth of speech and actually bringing into the will an activity that's relating or striving to relate to the divine spiritual powers, but doing it out of freedom rather than out of fear of punishment or some kind of legalistic version of the law. The Old Testament is the testament of law, whereas the New Testament is the testament of love. And so in being able to come to an understanding of this concept of the Logos as being an expression of this impulse of warmth of speech, bathing the pineal and pituitary centers and establishing this frontal shield of the seraphim, so to speak. And this shield of love, the spirits of love, the seraphim, that are so far that they're beyond our normal perception, and that it gets into what Dionysius the Areopagite referred to as the negative knowledge. And by negative, I don't mean like bad in the sense of negation, but in the sense of more the cloud of unknowing, and that we should not have the hubris to think that we're capable of fully being able to conceive of the nature of the Trinity and the Father, our Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, that divine being. And an interesting book that's Pseudo Dionysius and the Metaphysics of Aquinas by Fran O'Rourke. And in here he says, negative theology thus assumes for Aquinas a greatly superior role in understanding God. He indicates the limitations of positive theology and presents as its consequence the need for negative and transcendent theology. The intention of the latter is in no way negative. Its purpose is not to diminish our appreciation of what knowledge we have gained, but to place God beyond all our estimation. Early in his commentary on the divine names, Aquinas notes with approval that for Dionysius, granting the names gained through casual reflection that, quote, that in itself which God is remains hidden, end quote. We know God, according to Aquinas, only as first principle of all perfection and as cause through his goodness in all participations. What he is in himself remains inscrutable and ineffable. And so that kind of sums up the reality that perhaps we're not going to come to any sense of closure in our search for truth. But that doesn't mean that we give up, but it's kind of like Robert Browning, man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? And so you have this whole concept of that there is that which is so ineffable that it defies description, at least at our stage of understanding. And so we proceed along this path as a quest, and knowing that it's hubris to think that we're going to actually fully succeed in being able to comprehend this ineffable mystery. And so when you get into that and you take the quotation I posted the other day on FB of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, he says, wisdom lies solely in truth. And I don't know anybody that's very bright that would disagree with that. But then you get into the whole hubris of trying to narrow it down to measure number and weight. And I love the quotation of the Marquisa Isabella de Merteuil, played by Glenn Close in Dangerous Liaisons, the film of recent memory that was from the book Liaisons Dangereuses by Pierre Ambroise. And that was from 1782. And she says, like most intellectuals, he's intensely stupid. And so, not to look askance on anybody, but that's just kind of a funny way of pointing it out, is that, oh, you think you've got it all figured out, eh? And that gets into an interesting search that's not a new concept, but it gets into the idea of mathesis universalis. Reverend David from the City of London in merry old England, how are you?
Good afternoon, my friend, in this football-torn land of failures. Gosh, where do I begin with all of that? I can't stand Glenn Close. I can't stand Glenn Close. Love, you know, you're not Meryl Streep. Live with it, please. Give us all a break. I also hate the Liaison Dangereuse. I made the mistake of seeing it performed, the play performed on a London stage many years ago, where the chief protagonist, because it was a small theatre, decided to move across the stage adjacently in an adjacent motion like a crab, and sort of weirdly crawling. And all I could do was think of that for the rest of the performance. I mean, why are you doing that, man, for God's sake? And I hate the way it ends, where all the women, you know, all the nastiness and all the backstabbing has finally come out, and the old matron trying to keep the women and these awful girls a bit like St. Trinian's under control, says caustically, I have letters. And you, oh God, so all of that dueling and all of that insulting has just ended up in some old bag threatening somebody else, that it will all be made public, and it's as simple as that. Oh God. That aside, oh Meryl, I love you. Meryl, I love you. Do more work with Yo-Yo Ma. I love you. Oh gosh, how am I today? I don't know, to be honest. I suppose I don't put those things down to hubris, although that is the mark of our times. I tend to put things like that more in pure and simple old-fashioned terms, like idolatry. Let's call a spade a spade. People's, I mean, what am I thinking of there? A friend of mine, to be more accurate, Rupert Short, who is, I think, religious correspondent for The Guardian. I can't quite remember. Telegraph, Guardian, wrote a book a couple of years ago called God is Nothing, which seems to have caused a minor row in various circles. And at the time made me chortle, there's a word. Has anybody actually read Thomas Aquinas? Because by definition, God is no thing. Fatty Aquinas goes on and on and on and bloody on about it. So, has anybody in theology school actually bothered to read any of this stuff? Oh gosh, apart from that, I love my Polish brothers and sisters, but apart from chortling, also gurgling with delight at the fact in their pro-traditional Catholic, anti-LGBT stance, they're now trying to pretend Chopin wasn't gay and trying to turn their back on all his letters wanting to kiss his boyfriend. So apart from that, I suppose I'm okay. I mean, it's quite an achievement having got to this stage with all these shows. I think one of the enduring formulas is we do come at it from a creative angle, and I wish more people would do that. I mean, the trouble I have with Anglo-American culture per se, you notice I've added both elements there, is its present scientism, where everything must be weighed or measured, but you're none the wiser afterwards. I mean, it was something Schopenhauer said. The modern sciences were like everybody introducing themselves through their relationship. That's my uncle, he's my brother. Oh, isn't that your auntie? But you know nothing about the people involved afterwards. And it's as though no conversation has actually happened. So you know all the relationships, but you don't know anything else. And that's not to disparage the sciences. I'm a great lover and great admirer of the natural sciences. And that's not to take away the mysticism from the new physics, which is clearly mystical in most of its permutations. It's just to say, man doesn't live by bread alone. We're not simply denizens of the physical universe. We're creatures, we're entities of a number of different modes of reality. Modalities of divine expression. When you were speaking, I was thinking of Spinoza, someone I hugely admire, not only a moral giant, but also, of course, it depends whose side you're on. Some people think he's an atheist, and other people used to describe him as the God-intoxicated man. So it depends whose side you're on. Certainly, I can't think of a more religious rationalist than Spinoza. The clue, of course, is given by the fact that his book, The Ethics, when it was published in Holland, actually had a red rose on its cover. That's a giveaway. That's a real giveaway of Rosicrucianism, in a time frame when it wasn't meant to be there, of course. And he would have said very clearly, I think people get him entirely wrong. What does God want? He wants our love. How do we worship God? We worship God through love, through our good deeds. What is it? Deus sive natura, God or nature. Now, what he has not done is reduce God to nature. What he's actually done, what he's actually saying is that we can know two things about God, and that's about it. that God is somehow a substance and that God is somehow, extension, that we understand time and space and all the things that happen within time and space. And that's about it. And that will take human beings the rest of time. But that's it. That's as far as we've got with the divine mystery. So all of that is on my mind, and the fact that it's very difficult to prepare for this show because the conversation is beautifully Taoist. It goes as it listeth, the spirit goes as it listeth, and enjoying every single second. Yes, I've noticed your show on cosmic intelligence, and I admire it. I haven't had the chance to dip into it much at the minute. Certainly, it's a very, very laudable project. But I suppose, I'll nail my colours to the mast like Luther. I mean, I'm influenced by American transcendentalism. That should get me into some hot water. What a wonderful group of people. And apart from the fact that self-reliance is an important virtue, get off your ass and get a job. Apart from all that, is very, very important for the modern world. The fact that they all knew there are points at which this world is left behind, as wonderful, as marvelous, as miraculous as it is. They're forecasting God, as many churches do. I wonder how many churches God is actually involved in at the minute. I do want to be that harsh. Apart from the fact theology has now been reduced to, as I said before, a checklist of ideas in the head and little else. So what? Which can't be verified. Therefore, there's constant consternation, constant argument between the denominations who have nothing to say in a world of need, plenty, and desperation for the gospel. Their good news is not good news, and they've got nothing to say to most of humanity. And their image of God is, excuse me, as a nitpicking physics teacher who knows you're going to fail the exam and is out to get you and wants to give you homework. I mean, that's their view of God. So the idea of anything beautiful or transcendent or true, I'll give you an idea what I have in mind before I pass you back. There was a wonderful, was it Raymond Briggs, who used to do those books, British guy, I think, used to do those books about in cartoon forms. You have the Snowman in recent years, and you had the other one, the best book C&D ever purchased, about the old couple in rural Britain, just about to be involved in World War III, a nuclear exchange. Deeply, deeply, deeply depressing. But I remember something charming, and it came out in the book just as powerfully as the cartoon movie version. And it sort of hit me as a minister in the face when I saw it. The snowman takes the young kid to the magical land, probably Iceland, where all the snowmen get together and have a party, and all the different snowmen are obscuring something. And all of a sudden, Father Christmas appears, and he's just smiling, and the music and the illustrations give it away that this is just a good, happy person. And it's almost a transcendental moment, because you get the impression that's why he's Father Christmas, and that's why he is what he is. And that's why you will never understand and never really appreciate what he's doing, how he's acting in the world, what he's giving to the world. And it's just wonderfully uplifting because it's Father Christmas. So if you take that as a kid's version, as a kid's grasp of a much more serious idea, that there is something transcendental in the world, there is something which is no thing, but utterly wonderful, utterly good, utterly beautiful, utterly true, then all of a sudden, all the churches are suddenly put to shame because they haven't got the slightest idea how to convey these things, much to the idolatry of all of them. Just a few thoughts in as I say, football-torn London. I believe England's playing again. Don't care if you win or not. There we are. What's the best way to keep the plebs under control in a time of disastrous social manipulation? Give them a game of football and the nationalistic jingo that goes with it. I'll hand back to you, John.
Well, we're in no doubt your feelings in that regard. Yeah, well, getting into getting into that whole idea of the Mathesis Universalis, the universal understanding, right? And that they actually, although well-intentioned, thought that they could find a way of creating this language of universal understanding. But then it just makes me hearken back to Goethe's quotation in a letter where he said, mathematicians are a kind of Frenchmen. Whenever you say anything or talk to them, they translate it into their own language, and right away, it is something completely different. And so you have that to struggle with. And it's interesting that in looking at this, let's see, now I have to find where I was here. It'll only take me a moment. Well, maybe I won't find it. Oh, here it is. It's right in front of me. No wonder I can't find it. It's right in front of me. But yes, so Amathesis Universalis is the science, the universal science. Mathesis is like science, and Universalis is to be universal. And it's like, it was basically envisioned in its most well-known version by René Descartes and Leibniz, the mathematicians, although there was quite a few others that were searching in that regard, but perhaps the most direct is John Wilkins, and the Right Reverend John Wilkins, in this essay toward a real character in a philosophical language in 1668. And it appears as though they're going to try and reconstruct language so that each aspect of the language has meaning. It's kind of like ancient Hebrew in that each letter brings in another concept, so they're trying to make a more kind of Apollonian classification system. But there's always that Dionysian element asserting itself of that unknowingness. That, are you sure there isn't something you're not including in your representation of the universe? And if you get into Rudolf Steiner's work, which I explore in depth in my books, where he talks about the 12 fundamental philosophical viewpoints, and that they all have something they can contribute to understanding the world, but it's a mistake to just take one of them and go, aha, I have found it, because you're not going to be able to get into the nuance of all the other viewpoints that are based coming from a different perspective. It's like the old adage of there's a tree and a guy writes a poem, another guy takes writes an essay, and another fellow takes a photograph, the other guy paints a picture. It's the same tree, and they're all sitting on different sides of the same tree, but they're coming out with things that you might even think that they're talking about a different thing. And so we have to have respect for the reality of our unknowing, and hearkening back to that classic of mystical literature, The Cloud of Unknowing. And so that there is that divine darkness, as it's sometimes represented, that you had the divine light, you had the divine darkness, and it's not the darkness of evil as it's that darkness, that womb of darkness, the mother womb of darkness that it bears the light. And it's through the light meeting the darkness that the visible world comes into being. And as Goethe said, colors are the deeds and sufferings of light. And so you have this idea of understanding the nature of a rainbow, and his difference from Newton in getting into understanding exactly how the colors of a rainbow are produced. And whereas Goethe's work on colors, which he considered the most important work he ever did, kind of got misunderstood because when they printed it, they got the colors wrong in some of the diagrams, and it kind of gave somebody an easy dig to deprecate it. But yet, Newton's whole thing is mathematic variance, whereas with Goethe, he says that space is that field of darkness, so that when you look at the darkness of space through a light-filled atmosphere, you get the color blue, and that's why the sky is blue. Whereas the sunset is red, he said, because when you look through the darkness at light, it appears red. And that's something you can observe during the course of your day. And if you can find a valid argument against that, then more power to you. And some people, some guy sent me an essay he wrote that's kind of a compromise between the two. But it's good to think on these things. But in getting into Right Reverend John Wilkins, here's a guy very principled. In fact, he was the head of Oxford at one time. He was head of Cambridge at another time. He was a fellow and founder of the Royal Society. And so he was very critical in being able to bring about the compromises that were necessary, and that in the Royal Society, it was against the rules to discuss politics or religion. And it's kind of like here, except we get it a little bit of the religious thing, but it's that way they could invite all the different denominations, that people who were skilled and worthy of recognition, even though they weren't Anglican or they weren't Puritan or whatever. They were one of the dissenting ministers. It didn't matter because they weren't going to be talking about that, and that was a way in which a attempt to bring about a reconciliation in the conflicts that had preceded the founding of the Royal Society. And it's interesting because when you look deeper at it and you realize that the founding principle of the Royal Society were basically the rules of a Masonic lodge. Because in a Masonic lodge, you don't discuss politics and you don't discuss religion. And so, not that they necessarily always keep that, it's sometimes used as a secret meeting house for those very issues. But nonetheless, the principle is there. But in the same token, when you take it that far, then you're saying, can you reduce your worldview to where you don't include the subject matter that is dealt with in religion? That is the supersensible. Because if you don't have a relationship to the supersensible, then I asked you, what is the point of your religion? Because religio means to unite. Well, what are you uniting with? If there is no supersensible, you're just going to unite with your body. You're already there. So it's a little bit of a challenge. But yes, the transcendentalists. Actually, the American that Rudolf Steiner speaks most glowingly of, and I didn't know where he's going to come up today. We'll do a transcendentalist show one of these days, because that's a lot of fun when you get into Bronson Alcott and that whole group, the Twilight Club. But Rudolf Steiner speaks quite glowingly of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and which is interesting because really what Ralph Waldo Emerson cut his teeth on the translations of Thomas Taylor of Plato and the Neoplatonic authors, and a lot of which came to him through Bronson Alcott, and Thomas Johnson of Missouri, who's an interesting character that most people have never even heard of, but I actually even have a book on him, which is like a real rare bird indeed. But he published it was a magazine called the Platonist, and it was published out of Missouri. And there's still to this day a really substantial collection of Neoplatonic and all various studies pertaining to this at the University of Missouri. And so it's very telling that this whole idea of the Greek understanding of the way in which nature works is very significant in the evolution of Western thought, although it has been superseded to a large extent by the scientism, which is basically taking science and saying that there's some kind of finality in science, when any real scientist will tell you, well, no, this is our operating thesis at this point, because every year they have to have a new textbook to cover the omissions. And so, yeah, I'm with you there, David.
I got into trouble once. I get into trouble a lot, actually. I got into trouble once for reminding everybody at a rather noble meeting of the Royal Society that there's never been a scientific theory that has stood the test of time, and was practically arm locked out of the room. So, well, yeah, prove me wrong. Yeah, people mistake the search for knowledge, that wonderful Greek idea, for a religious grasp of eternal knowledge. And that's a very dangerous mistake to make, because you end up with aberrations of knowledge. You end up with Nazi Germany, and you end up, if you're not careful, and you end up with Stalinist Russia. Do you know, I know the truth, and all these people that won't admit it really have to be punished, maybe even killed, until everybody knows the truth once and for all. You've got to be really careful of that stuff. Again, who do I blame? The churches. Why do I blame the churches? Because it's our job to make sure things like that don't happen. You know, we're there for a reason. I mean, so many areas of human life have been abandoned by the modern church in all of its permutations: Catholic, Protestant, Free Church, Dissenter. I suppose I see myself increasingly as a dissenter. At the moment, I'm wondering if I'm not sort of independent anthroposophical pastor, because it seems to be all I'm talking about at the minute. There's a thought. And you know, I covered a lot of it during our last service last week, and that's what I'll be talking about next month. So yeah, it reminded me also, I suppose, as we were speaking, of Hermann Hesse, the first, not a transcendentalist, but someone with clear tendencies and leanings for a mere European like myself. Certainly his idea of a universitas literarum, a universal literature, which would be the key to actually unlocking every other type of universality. That's been on my mind a lot, curiously, independent of this show. He was the first author I read seriously, the first author I cut my teeth on, which is why I've got no teeth left. He, an astonishing man. I mean, I love the short stories and the novellas almost as much as his Nobel Prize winning novel, The Glass Bead Game, which has so many different levels to it. You sort of despair at each new reading. You know, oh, for God's sake, how could I have missed that before? So, you know, he's one of those astonishing authors who's a bookman writing for bookmen. He's an author writing for authors who nevertheless has this sort of weird appeal to everybody else. And the hippies, of course, embraced him back in the day because of the type of cogitations, the type of research he was undertaking. And I did actually mean the word research, because he was involved, of course, with a group of, what would they call them these days, truth seekers, one of whom included Carl Jung, hardly an underachiever. And they were looking, in one of the novels, they call themselves the League of Eastern Wayfarers, I seem to remember. And of course, that was one of the permutations, the actual name of this group. They used to go on things like church crawls, like me, where you go to a place, you're on vacation, and there are a couple of staggeringly beautiful historical piles, and one tends to go in for a dry sherry in my case. In their case, it was probably schnapps. And then you expose yourself to the beauty of the building around you. Oh my God, isn't that wonderful? Like any true aesthete. Oh, the colour of that stained glass. How did they think of that? And it's just a delightful thing to do. And I noticed the journeyers used to go on similar church crawls, and they were looking for something, but I never really put my finger on what it was they felt they were trying to do, because it's not a question from the scientism of the background culture. If we weigh it, if we measure it, if we observe it, somehow we've conquered it and understood it. They were looking for something ineffable. They were looking for the fingerprints of something other that had left its mark, that had left its signature, working through the architects, working through the stonemasons, working through the people making the stained glass windows, the glaciers. And that in itself leads me to think, my God, there are different types of research and different types of interpretation and different types of scientific. I mean, what was it Professor Hampshire said? Any body of organized knowledge technically is a science. It doesn't have to be simply the type that weighs and measures. I mean, there are other ways of organizing knowledge. And with the greatest respect, which I hope I've already shown to the scientific community, that's really a bit of a blunderbuss. There are other ways of understanding the world, whether you like it or not. And they're equally formidable. So, yeah, what was it this group of seekers were actually seeking for, and actually finding that they were getting results, which is the bit that interests me most. But, I think I'll hand you back to on that note, John, because I could go on and on and on. I mean, certainly the idea of a universal knowledge, which is somehow already present piecemeal, and all we've got to do is join the dots. I mean, that's a very alluring thought. On that note, I will hand back to you.
Well, it's actually woven into the ancient sacred culture of Northern Europe, this whole principle. And you look in Rudolf Steiner's indications regarding the northern mysteries and the mysteries of the Droten in Germanic countries, or the Druids. There was this specific impulse that had to do with a 12-fold mystery, which also harkens back to the Old Testament with the 12 tribes, right? And so you have this 12-fold mystery, and he talks about how the northern mysteries in Northern Europe were established by Siegfried, as he's usually referred to, or Sigge. And that Sigge, he was the 13th above the 12, and that each of the 12 representatives were meant to embody one of the 12 facets of the universal wisdom. And if they could incorporate the mystery in that way, it gave them access to a higher level of what you might call montic knowledge. And likewise, you have that in the 12 Knights of the Round Table surrounding King Arthur, that same archetype of that 12-fold cosmic mystery, because that's the mystery of cosmic space. And then you have the 7-fold mystery of cosmic time and the 7 moods of soul. And so when you bring into relationship these 7 moods of soul, the 7 planetary harmonics in the context of the 12 directions of space, you see that's what we're working with. And But it behooves one to try and strive at our stage of evolution, because we haven't yet embodied the wisdom, the Sophia, with the merging of the Christ Logos with the Manas, the Sophia wisdom, so that it's that love wisdom, and that we're moving, as we move into the future in the second half of Earth evolution, it's transmuting the Earth into the cosmos of love. Before that, it was the cosmos of wisdom. But if you look at the ancient mysteries, you saw that they went into their decadent phase, and that because they were coming out of the microcosmic mysteries, that there could be failings. Because, well, what if the guy who's taken the position of Siegfried isn't such a nice guy? You know, you got a problem there. It becomes a tool of power and the whole idea of the machinations of humans. And so many lower things came about, and that's expressed in the Grail legend of Parsifal as the Klingsor stream, and you have Klingsor with the Grail maiden who's been perverted, Kundry, who becomes redeemed by Parsifal. But that's hearkening back to Herodias and the head of John the Baptist on the platter, when she, she's told by Herod, you can have what do you want? You can have anything you want. And she says, I want the head of John the Baptist served to me on a platter. It's like, of all things, she chose that, right? And so you have that shadow image of the mysteries, because what is the head? It's that cosmic. So taking that cosmic element and distorting it to its lowest level, and that the mystery of the head, that the head is the past, so to speak, and that's the wisdom element. That's the manas. The Holy Spirit is something that we need to evolve to, but we need to have it connected to the principle of the Christ Logos, and that's the key element. It's not good enough for it to just be a Luciferic wisdom. It has to be redeemed through the blood of Christ, and that's the actual action of the highest being that's ever entered into Earth evolution, with the solar Logos incarnating into Jesus of Nazareth at the baptism, and going through the whole drama of Golgotha and coming out in his resurrection body as an expression of the goal of human evolution, which is to be able to carry these things further in their redeemed form, as we move towards St. Paul's prophecy that ye shall be as the angels.
You caught me out there, John. Yeah, I'm a little wary of certain modern translations of scripture, because they seem to be, everything's based on a theological view anyway. And I notice the outrageous claim of Jesus that ye shall be as gods is now being watered down into something a little more comprehensible, a little more palatable, because it suits the churches not to talk about it. And as usual, yeah, stop it. Pastor, I'm really sorry you can't inspire your flock. Why don't you resign and let someone else do it? Maybe they'll stand a better chance. The church has got to stop aggrandizing its mission and start living its mission. What I've got in mind at the moment, this is the bit that gets us into hot water, John. I've been following these claims and counterclaims, of various unmarked graves in Canada that seem to be linked with nunneries, sisterhoods, and I've been speaking to Jesuit friends of mine as well as some journalists, and it's actually quite interesting what seems to be the case. Basically, there were programs. How could our ancestors, our forebears, be such total bastards? There's a mystery that we need to look at. It seems to be that it was really unpalatable. Remember when I said a minute ago, we've got the truth. I mean, if re-education happens in the Soviet Union, that's outrageous. But if it happens in our part of the world, it's simply cultural assimilation. All these native Canadians, why can't they see the ways of the white man are better? For God's sake. So if we do the same, and that was what was happening, children being forcibly taken from their families and their culture to assimilate them, to assist the speed of assimilation, isn't that good of their governments? Into sort of the prevalent Anglo-Saxon culture, what appears to have happened was a lot of these kids were looked at by the sisters, were looked after by the sisters. You see, I don't believe the church is malevolent. I believe it can become malevolent, but I don't believe it is malevolent. Obviously, I wouldn't. There we are. Who are trying to alleviate that process somehow and got involved in all sorts of issues to do with poverty and the lack of medicine, lack of proper medical health care. And all of these bodies actually had graves that were marked by little wooden crosses. So nobody's talking about a mass grave. They're talking about unmarked graves. And despite the protestations of the sisters, what the various governments in Canada wouldn't do is actually spend any money to put the little wooden crosses back of the kids that had passed over during that period. So now it looks like they're unmarked graves. So, it's disaster after disaster after disaster. Who do I blame? The church. Certainly the hubris of the Catholic Church, forgive me, Catholic brothers and sisters, is that it can never be questioned. Do you know who you're dealing with? You're dealing with the church. It's just not helpful. Phrases like Prince of the Church, they're not helpful. Our good Lord washed the feet of his followers. He didn't say, bow down on your knees to me. That didn't happen. So, you're looking at problems that then get out of control and that nobody can deal with in the right way, which is absolutely terrifying. Cultures tend to have the same hubris. Every culture has to present itself as the best culture, as opposed to something shining and beautiful and striving to take the human condition into a better place, whether that's Hebrew culture, Greek culture, Egyptian culture, British culture. My God, if you're looking at a litany of errors and where moral problems get out of control and go horribly wrong, just take 5 minutes looking at British history. It seems to be the same thing over and over again, which you very generously term as hubris, which I rather, the pastor in me is coming out, forgive me, it's idolatry, pure and simple. If you put something in the place of God, that is when the nightmares start to crawl out of your religion and everything around you falls to bits. If you're putting something in the place of the Almighty, what do you expect to happen? Every idol you erect has feet of clay, and it will fall apart and it will fall on you. So yeah, no, I'll hand back to you, John. After the Northern Mysteries, I think are deeply misunderstood. I mean, partly that's the fault of Fatty Blavatsky, who was, if it's not from India, it's not worth discussing. I mean, no, love. There are a lot, and her views of shamanism are appalling. And that's, of course, basically the zeitgeist of her particular time speaking. A group of savages doing a jig, doing a bit of a dance on the mud flats. Actually, there's a lot more to it than that. And the origin of all mystical systems, of course. So, yeah, what we need to do is have a less hubristic attitude to each other. The church has to get on its knees and apologize to absolutely everybody for failing to do its mission. And what cultures have to do, science is the worst example of it at the moment. Everybody now has to bow down to the god Apollo, or they'll be fried by a nuclear weapon. Yet no, it's the same thing again and again and again. You worship my quantum entanglement, or the missiles will start coming in your direction. No. Why can't we all just remember we're human and enjoy the journey? What's so wrong with that? Browning came up a bit earlier, and I like his. Of course, in his own day, he was a very unsuccessful poem. It's only since that time everybody's decided to follow his lead. And the character sketches he used to do, like Kashish, the picker up of learning's crumbs, the Islamic doctor, that knew he didn't understand everything. But one day, everything under good Allah would make sense. That's a human attitude. Compared to Cleon, who's the Greek philosopher in another poem by Browning, who absolutely knows everything, sees a young man with muscles all a ripple chatting to some other young lovely nearby and realizes his life is pointless and empty because he's an old man. So, that's where materialism tends to lead you. I do take a different view from one of the things you said. I think the body is almost as much of a mystery as the mind. We tell ourselves we know lots about it, but do we really? Do we really know the material universe as much as we think we do? But yeah, which leads me, I suppose, to the last point. Then I promise I'll give it. I'll hand the baton back. The Northern Mysteries, despite Fatih Blavatsky, you get the impression all the time that there's so much more in all of them, layer upon layer upon layer. And the church has gone out of its way to, I think in their case, not so much trash, but obscure what was being said. I mean, certainly the universalist, the universal idea of a rainbow bring the bridge to the gods, which of course Alice Bailey talks about, the Antakarana bridge between different levels of consciousness. You do find echoes of that in Siegfried's adventures. You do find echoes of that in how this world links not simply with Asgard, but with simply, or should I say Asgarth, as I'm told by my heathen friends, Asgarth. Yet they're as bad as the Christians. Give it a rest. Do you know there was a row I heard recently? Which eye of Odin had actually been removed? Give it a rest, for God's sake. Does it matter? And there's heated exchange. Well, if he wears the eye patch over the left eye, well, that means, for heaven. How long were the nails that impaled our good Lord to the cross? Anything apart from doing what he said to do, anything. And it really is ridiculous. But yeah, the Northern Mysteries, I think, in particular, because they're making a comeback, which is the unexpected cultural enlivening that's happening around us at the minute, which even I didn't expect, I must admit that. And that's because those mysteries are telling, and they're half still there, they're hidden. So, I mean, a dear friend of mine is the anthropologist Richard Rudgley. His last book, what was it? The Return of Odin? I can't remember. How about this, John? As a book lover, as a man involved in books, you'll love this. Richard sue me, if you ever listen to this. I was there. I remember it all. It was going to be the tour de force, the crowning achievement of all of his earlier books. I sat at a table in Notting Hill with him years back having a cup of coffee, and it was meant to be this crowning achievement where he was going to write about sort of a global religions, and he was going to put paganism at the top instead of the bottom. So you didn't actually start with paganism. That was the deep mysteries of the Stone Age culture. And you got all the way to neo-paganism. Then he went away and thought about it and wrote a book about Odin. And they dropped him like a hot brick because they didn't get the book they paid for. Hey, it's his best book. It's his best book. And that was, it's The Return of Odin. The Return of Odin, a bloody good book. And of course, what he's basically describing in that is gods don't die. Ye shall be as gods. Gods don't die. I never include the Abrahamic view of God, because you're not simply talking about a God. with a lowercase g or an uppercase g. You're talking about nothing. Therefore, they are not the same concept. But the gods can revive; they don't die. And the terrifying thoughts towards the end of his book. The archetype known as Odin is beginning to stir again from his slumber. But if it comes out the wrong way, if it enlivens itself in the wrong way, you end up with aberrations like Nazi Germany. But what would it be in the right way? What would it mean if it woke up and took its place in the sensorium in the right way? An incredible idea, and certainly something that admirers of the so-called Northern Mysteries need to put their mind to, more than what the colour of Odin's eye cap was, and did he wear a big hat into a room or not? I'll hand it back to you, John.
Yeah, well, I guess the only ones that are supposed to wear their hats indoors are kings and prelates, and widows with Kleenex on their head. There, yeah, you know, when you get into that, and you say, well, okay, fine. I mean, it's an exploration in thought, an exploration in tradition, but given that. The indications of Rudolf Steiner, he says, and he's very much to the point, that with Siegfried establishing the Northern Mysteries, who Siegfried is none other than Scythianos, who also established a mystery center on the shores of the Black Sea, and that he had a very specific role. He's the hidden one of Rosicrucianism. And likewise at the Mystery Center in Ireland. And Rudolf Steiner indicates that the translation of the Northern Mysteries, that the North European cultures were very primitive intellectually. And because they were primitive, they were capable of taking in the newness that was coming up from the mystery of Golgotha. And that Siegfried or Scythianos had used music as a means for being able to transmit. And so you have these poems of the North and all that were given in musical form. And that it's that musical culture that created the building process within Northern European cultures to be able to evolve into mathematics and science in its later stages. And all you need to do is go, well, just look at like Beethoven, which is like the fruit of that, right? It's like there is no Beethoven anywhere else in the world. There is no symphonic. You could say what you want. You may not even care for classical music, but you can't deny that it is the most developed, the most sophisticated musical expression in the history of mankind. And that to be able to have that experience, and I got into a little bit of this the other day with Douglas, because in writing The Birth of Tragedy, Friedrich Nietzsche got into the whole idea of the Apollonian, that which is signifying order, and the Dionysian, that which is defies order. That's the chaos principle in essence. So you got your left and right brain, so to speak, in the sense of Julian Jaynes and all that kind of theorizing about neurological activity. But this is deeper than, more profound than that, and that Nietzsche was exploring the concepts of Greek tragedy, and he came to the conclusion after being invited by Richard Wagner, because at the time Nietzsche was just a young man, and The Birth of Tragedy was his first book. And he had met Richard Wagner, and Wagner invited him to see performance of his music, and he went there, and he came to the conclusion that the path to redemption was through the music as expressed by Richard Wagner. And Rudolf Steiner said that that's very, very interesting from the standpoint of that, although Richard Wagner didn't quite get there in the libretto, that he was not able to conceptualize the full extent of what was involved. Nonetheless, that he did succeed at it musically, and if you look at art and religion as being higher than philosophy, like we're always saying, and I don't think there's an episode where we leave it out, you see that these are the components in human culture that tend towards an upbuilding of the etheric body, which is the transformation into life spirit. It's a very slow process. Whereas the thinking principle, the manas of the two-petal lotus, is a quicker process. And that's what we're moving towards. We're in the consciousness soul period. And the next period will be the period of the spirit self. And so that's that monastic principle, the higher mind aspect, which is eulogized in Western Hermetic tradition as the holy guardian angel, right? And so there's that manas that is so critical for our future development. But it's not just manas by itself, but it's manas that's tinged with buddhi, which is the principle of compassion, the principle of the Christ logos. And so when we get into understanding that, and then you get into what you had said about the body being extremely profound, it's very true. It's our oldest member, because old Saturn was the primal physical, old sun is the primal etheric, old moon is the primal astral, and now we're here on Earth with the fruit of all that development. And Rudolf Steiner says all you need to do is look at the structure of the thigh bone to the hip and the weight supporting dynamic that modern science couldn't even pull that off, unless they just deliberately copied it. And you see some of that kind of architectonics expressed in the flying buttresses of the Gothic cathedrals. It was a very novel innovation to be able to have weight bearing distributed by these external flying buttresses that you see on the great Gothic cathedrals of the Templar period. And so in understanding that, and you go back into the old Stone Age in ancient India, they had a being that they referred to that was just beyond comprehension. And they called that being Vishvakarman. And the Vishvakarman means the builder, basically. That's the principle of that building, that is their version of understanding the logos, the same principle we've been talking about. And that different cultures had different terminologies, different ways of looking at, because they were in a different place amongst a different group of people at a different stage of the evolution of mankind. And so you see that there's this culmination in the mystery of Christ, that this higher being finally came to earth, and he's here now. And so, as St. Paul says, in which we live and move and have our being.
I've got to be irreverent. I'm sorry. I've got to drag this show down to the level of a schoolyard for the minute. I love your haircut, and you're reminding me of Alan Bennett from Aleister Crowley's mob, only because he was such an intellectual and a man worthy of respect. I remember he turned up in one of the novels of Aleister Crowley, Moonchild, as Mahathera Fang at the... or Fang, I can't remember, Fang, at the end of the book, blazing with light to show MacGregor Mathers and those imposters who was right and who was wrong. You cut a very fine figure in your sort of Martin Luther-esque lack of hair. It's making me look like the wild man of Borneo. I might have to visit, if we're allowed to, in Boris Johnson's dictatorship, I might have to try and find a barber during the week. Gestalt and the body. There's something called the incarnation. Christians who deny the body seem to have forgotten the whole point was something to do with the incarnation. Yeah, God entered the universe of material things for particular reasons. Therefore, the minute we abandon that, you end up not only in the false nirvana of not ever really having a pleasure, not ever really having a nice time, not ever really eating the nice foods, tasting a good wine. You end up, no doubt you've got a certain type of peace of mind, but let's face it, it's only because you've actually thrown the incarnation back at God. You know, it wasn't worth doing. That's the implication. Yeah, therefore you're, as Alan Bennett used to say, and all those Buddhist boys, you've ended up with a false nirvana. It is not nirvana. It's just a sort of temporary cessation of the great battle, but you're meant to be involved in the great battle, not avoiding it. Back to the spiritualization of matter, which is a different way of talking about the incarnation, of course. John suddenly rushed to the camera. I don't know what that means. Oh, Wagner. I love all the different Wagners. I love the fact that Wagner, as a young man, went to see Schopenhauer as an old man. I've always had a soft spot for Schopenhauer. Was he really the philosopher of pessimist, or was he just bitter that he wasn't some sort of Buddhist? And the young pretender turned up at his door, and basically Wagner, to paraphrase rapidly, told him to sod off because he didn't think much of his operas. Sod off, Richard, sod off, yeah. And so that comes to mind. Yeah, libretto. Oh God, libretto. I love that sort of weird, strained, non-linear libretto that goes with operas. You know, oh Linda, oh you who should have chosen the right balcony to climb towards. And what sort of, that would take 30 seconds to deliver. I love all that. I don't know. For once, I might actually disagree with the adept Steiner himself, because that is funny. Let's face it. Oh, Linda, oh, you've got the wrong balcony. Because it's all there. I think libretto. Anyone who's called to write libretto has really been given the poison chalice. If you're dealing with someone composing opera, I mean, right, there we are. This weekend I'll say extra prayers for people writing libretto. Intellect. I have great trouble with, as I think is becoming apparent, what the denuded and deliberately restricted attitude to what knowledge is in our present Anglo-American culture. I admire that's possibly the word. I admire Freud, which might seem odd for a minister. I admire Wilhelm Reich, and he most certainly was very clear. We don't understand the body, and all of his theories, which basically were Freudian, not all of them, some of them, majority of them, are basically about the fact we don't understand the body. We don't understand our physicality. And we're not really living in our bodies effectively, which is really the problem. We don't even really enjoy sex. We don't really enjoy food. We don't really enjoy music. We're holding ourselves back in some way or other. Those are powerful ideas which shouldn't just be swept under the carpet. I mean, poor old Reich. I mean, was it a murder or not? I mean, clearly he went to jail through a misunderstanding. But and I know the stories. He was knifed to death a couple of days before coming out of jail, and it was all an accident, a misunderstanding. But there's just something. The old conspiracy theorist in me thinks that's so convenient. So let's get you shut up, and there's one problem out the way, because what he was saying really is a challenge to what is happening to Western culture. And Freud, I think, started that challenge. What Freud would have seen is the rational mind assuming domination over the rest of the mind, and there are other aspects of intelligence, and over the subconscious, because it's afraid of those things. Therefore, it cannot allow any rivals. That is not a trivial thought. That is a very, very important thought. So when I hear of people criticizing the mysteries of our ancestors or contextualizing in a certain way, yes, I fully agree. Were they bookmen? Were they scholars, our Norse ancestors? No, they were not. And they wouldn't have said they were. I mean, but even then, there are little bits of history that are haunting me as I'm saying this. When the scholar Saxo Grammaticus, the Grammaticus gives it away, came to Britain, the Druids actually said something. It might be an insult, I'm not sure, or it's something else. You know, when Saxo Grammaticus, the father of grammar, arrived in Britain, the Druids said to him, they thanked him for bringing his knowledge with him, and it was beyond compare. So either that's a gag at the stupid Saxons' expense, which is possible, or you're dealing with something else. Are you dealing with maybe thoughts that there are different types of intellectual understanding, some of which are non-rational? I like all of this new stuff. I like new stuff. Tradition is wonderful and the mysteries of the past are great. I like all this new stuff. Abraham Maslow and all the rest of it, peak experiences. I need a few more peak experiences. Isn't that great? The idea that there are things like emotional intelligence, I think, is brushed away far too quickly. It's abused as a concept nowadays. You know, every old piece of tosh that fails to get through a university system suddenly makes an appeal to emotional intelligence and somehow gets redeemed. But, you know, there is such a thing as emotional intelligence. And it's arguable that one of the sources of Northern theatre actually came from the Vikings. Did they have theatres? No. Did they have actors? No. Did they have scripts? No. Did they have a theology in any understood, with an understood clear pantheon in a way that we would grasp nowadays? No, they didn't. All of that's too early. You know, there weren't any nitpicking Latin masters in monasteries codifying it all. It was all too early. But they used to act by the graves of fallen warriors, particularly if it was a great warrior. They used to give enactments of battles he'd been involved in and his meeting with the gods. And some have argued their theology grew out of that. And of course, that would be a theatrical performance whereby other things would eventually evolve. That's emotional intelligence claiming its rightful place amongst the pantheon, that's a deliberately chosen word, of other types of intelligence. Maybe the Nords were trying to approach the world in an intuitive, creative way, which is just as valid as a rationalist and measuring way. I mean, the guy I got in mind, excuse me, then I will pass back to you, John, is one of my ultimate heroes, Friedrich Schiller, who even Hegel actually says is a philosopher. Even he admits it. You know, and Schiller, of course, is the friend of Goethe. They're close friends. They have falling outs, but they're very close friends. And of course, it was Goethe that encourages Schiller. You know, do you have all the credentials of the usual philosopher? No, but you're writing philosophy. Get on with it. And without that, probably Schiller wouldn't have completed his work, whereby imagination and the play instinct is actually documented. I mean, that hadn't been done before. And what Schiller was as a defender of theatre, as someone interested in the logical tradition, the rational tradition, but as someone saying, look, it's got severe limitations, even back in those days. And we've got to remember play. We've got to remember creativity, pure and simple. And who's best at that? Children, not adults. What can we learn from them? And in that time frame, that is genuinely revolutionary. And it's that type of contribution that needs to come back. On that Schillian moment, I will hand back to you, John.
Well, yeah, Schiller, I mean, his relationship to Goethe is just, it's hard for us in English-speaking countries to comprehend the impact on German nations of those two individuals, even though it got pushed into the background through political thinking. Nonetheless, it's just a part of German culture as a whole. And you'd be hard pressed to get through a day in Germany without hearing somebody saying a colloquial saying that leads back to either Goethe or Schiller. So they are as much a part of German culture as Shakespeare is of English culture. But in getting into a kind of a deeper level of this, we have to take a little pause here and share with you before I run out of time and forget altogether, which is always a possibility. Reverend David William Parry has 3 books available on Amazon. One is A Grammar of Witchcraft, which is a Shakespearean study. And as I always say, no, it's not a book on a how-to book on witchcraft. And here's his Shakespearean-esque poetry, Caliban's Redemption. Wonderful stuff. And his main work is Mount Athos Inside Me, Essays on Religion, Swedenborg and the Arts. It's edited by the very talented Daniela Irendust. And as I said, they're all available on Amazon. And as for myself, I have 2 books. My first book is The Arcana of the Grail Angel, The Spiritual Science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, a study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner of the underground streams of esoteric Christianity, which flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail, the Order of the Knights Templar, and the True Rosicrucian Order, with text and diagrams and a foreword by my good friend Douglas Gabriel. And my second volume is The Arcana of Light on the Path, which is more of a meditative tool. And there's a great many more diagrams added to this volume. And so you can get into some of the cosmological underpinnings of the discussions that we have here and explore those dynamics. Those are both available in the United States on eBay. And I have a link below to my academia page, but you can always just go to eBay and put in my name, John Barnwell, and Arcana, and it'll be in there. Also, if you're overseas, you can contact me directly through the academia page that's listed below or on private message on Facebook. And we can make arrangements to get the books to you overseas. And so there you have it. I did my part on that. And got these comments over here. Oh, Jordan Peterson thinks emotional intelligence doesn't exist. I'd love to talk to Jordan Peterson. I have a great respect for that guy in that he's worked so hard. It's just, I find it kind of odd that he, at this point, I can't see any awareness on his part of Rudolf Steiner, anthroposophy, spiritual science, although he seems to think that the deepest book that he knows of is the Red Book of Carl Jung, which is an interesting journey. Yeah, you know, I mean, I'm quite familiar with Carl Jung's works. We always had them for sale in the bookstore, sold a ton of them. And but I think that I always have to be reminded of the comments that Rudolf Steiner made regarding psychology and what became psychiatry. He says that you have individuals creating a science, but that don't even really know what a human being is. And I think that that's a strong underpinning there, because if if you can't come to the understandings that are expressed in the Secret Doctrine or in Rudolf Steiner's outline of esoteric science, or at least C.G. Harrison's Transcendental Universe about the sevenfold, the seven great mysteries, that you don't understand initiation, you don't understand the supersensible being and destiny of man. And on that point, there's very few points I stand firm on. That's one, happens to be one of them. And I challenge anybody to come up with a meaningful diatribe against what I just said. And most of the things that I've seen have been sophomoric at best. And so I challenge Jordan Peterson to come to terms, at least pick up C.G. Harrison's Transcendental Universe and tell us what you think. That'd probably be the quickest way to get into a polemic with the dear gentleman. And that's pretty interesting in that regard. But to get back and look at this, I think that what we have is in that art impulse, it gives you an opportunity to be able to come into something that's larger than yourself as a means for renewal. I mean, there was an article that came out fairly recently. They did a study in Japan, and they found that just taking a walk in the woods boosted your immune system by 30%. So there's something to be said for respecting nature, and that there could be things going on in nature that you don't understand quite yet. And hence the artistic approach is open-ended, in that you're allowing the space. Like in ancient Rome, they had a statue, and they had this courtyard with the statues of all the gods of all the different nations within the Roman Empire, and then they had this one statue there, the statue to the unknown God, just in case they left somebody out, they didn't want to offend them. And so it's with that regard, and with Goethe's admission, his aspirations of being a Hypsisterian, to be able to revere any excellence, whatever culture it comes from, whether Jewish, Christian, or pagan, and that he was never able to reconcile himself with any of the denominations that he had encountered. And so he's viewed in that regard, and he's an interesting character in and of himself. But yet, if you get into his works, like, for example, Faust, he would have never finished without Schiller's promptings to push him on to get it finished. And he got the second part done. And the ultimate culmination of the second part of Faust is the eternal feminine leads us ever upward. So it's that whole idea that's that principle of the Holy Spirit that's there to elevate humanity. Thinking that there's a higher level to thinking, because it partakes of things that you don't know yet. And so you have to be able to have an open mind to develop that higher principle. And what gives us the capacity for developing that higher mind is the principle of the Logos, and that artistic input we can be bringing into things that will give us the capacity to have a context for a higher form of wisdom, like what Rudolf Steiner indicated regarding Scythianos, that because he had instructed them using music, that built within the culture a capacity that ultimately, in its culmination, led to the development of sophisticated relation to mathematics and science. I mean, that's really I could think about that all day, and I would get insights all along the way. And so it's kind of that view that where you enter in the travels of Wilhelm Meister and Wilhelm Meister's apprenticeship, and his great novel of initiation, and so of Goethe, and so you have this whole idea, and to get into that the beautiful lily and the green snake, that fairy tale of Goethe's that was like kind of a high point expression. It was his version, in a sense, of the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. That there's this allegory, this fairy tale that embodies the principles of initiation. And what is the green snake turns into a rainbow and becomes a bridge, so that you have that whole idea that can take you beyond the reign of quantity, as it was called by Reneganon, and that there's something more to life than just a measure, number, and weight. And it seems as though we're at a culmination point here. So if you want to help build the bridge for us, then we're ready for it.
Well, I assume I meant to say my bit and go into the prayer. Jordan Peterson, what a legend in his own lunchtime. I mean, the old theatrical gag, but he proves the truth of it. A couple of reasonably smart things to say. Jordan, love, I know loads of people in bars that say smart things. It doesn't matter. They're drunks in a bar. You know what I mean? Who do I trust? Friedrich Schiller or Jordan Peterson? I mean, has anyone that doesn't think there's emotional intelligence, has he heard of music or psychiatry? Yeah, Jordan Peterson is barely worth talking about. Right, don't take umbrage, John. I sort of like Zizek. Yes, I know he's a bit of a commo, but I remember Jordan Peterson's encounter with Zizek, who managed to reduce him to ashes in slightly less than 5 minutes. So, you know, one of the great organic intellectuals of our time, and Jordan Peterson is not. Shut up. You know, can he actually give a lecture anywhere nowadays? No. He's managed to offend everybody. And not just the crazies at the fringe. He's managed to offend absolutely everybody. I'm sorry, Jordan, honey. That is not the way to make a career. You've got to get people on your side at some point. So I'm sorry, I can't take him seriously. You know, go out, get drunk, listen to some music, enjoy yourself. You know, leave your university department. You know, do whatever. Just get a bigger life. So on that note, God, that's the sort of thing that people needing psychiatric attention say, actually. Anyway, I've got to write the minister bit. Gosh, I don't feel very ministery today. I mean, last Sunday nearly killed me because we're doing so much in a short space of time. So I don't feel very ministry at the minute. I feel ministered out. I suppose, however, I noticed at the TEDx salon we did recently, I was honoured to be one of the speakers. I was speaking a lot about Christian universalism. Technically, whatever that means, I'm a Christian universalist. Not only does that mean that everyone is redeemed, you know, it's all something to do with divine reconciliation. It also means that you don't cut people off at the pass. You know, you don't let the cavalry arrive too early. You listen to what the opposition's got to say before the cavalry arrives. Universalism needs to come back. I mean, the original 6 great schools of Christianity, I know that's arguable, 4, 7, let's say 6. Most people in the ancient world thought there were 6. I noticed 5 of them were universalist, and that's the idea that's gone missing. That no matter what you do, no matter how idolatrous you become, that God loves you. What an incredible thought. No matter how offensive, no matter how reductive, no matter how ludicrous, no matter how wicked, God still loves you. That is what God does. God is love. Therefore, whether we're meant to take the advice of St. Paul and dream of being angels or not, let's remember that there's nothing we can do apart from hold the truths of faith in our heart. It is not our intellect in any of its manifestations that will save us. It is faith in love. It is faith in beauty. It is faith in truth and wisdom. that they're basically the higher powers that Jesus Christ himself wants from us. Therefore, my friends on YouTube, my friends watching the show now, let's try and lead a loving, faithful life in the days ahead before the next show. Faith not only that this world can become a better place, because it can, but a bit more faith in each other despite all of the limitations, the hubris and the idolatry. Because we're all human, all too human, but Jesus Christ is our Saviour. May God's grace be with you one and all until we meet again. Amen.
Yes, thy will be done. Amen. Thank you, everybody. Reverend David, thank you so much. And if somebody wants to buy us a cup of coffee, they can always go to paypal.me /DParry777 or paypal.me /John Barnwell 888. I realize I always forget something. But that being said, thank you all for showing up. And for those that came later, hello.